tomorrow there are going to be big hearings up on Capitol Hill as we finally delve into Benghazi. We hear from three so-called whistleblowers. One reporter in town who has really contributed a lot to the narrative on what really happened on Benghazi has been Stephen Hayes from the Weekly Standard, who joins us down the line. Steve, good morning.
Morning, guys.
Before I let you tell the story, I just got to lay out a little of the background because I think this is really important. They were doing these talking points about what happened. And this is important because we know that Susan Rice went on the Sunday talk shows and weaved this tale about how it was a protest that spiraled out of control. You have done some great reporting on this, and let me just say, at one point the talking points said the following. These are the passages that were eventually struck out of the talking points. On 10 September, the agency notified, that's the CIA, notified Embassy Cairo of social media reports calling for a demonstration and encouraging jihadists to break into the embassy. The rest of it that was struck out during this talking point editing process was about who was responsible. Although the crowd almost certainly was a mix of individuals, that being said, there are indications that Islamic extremists participated in the violent demonstrations. That was knocked out. The wide availability of weapons and experienced fighters in Libya almost certainly contributed to the lethality of the attack. That was knocked out. The agency, again the CIA, has produced numerous pieces on the threat of extremists linked to al-Qaeda in Benghazi and eastern Libya. Since April, there have been at least 5 other attacks. This goes on and on. All of this was taken out of the talking points. Why?
Well, it's a good question. I think that's really the one of the reasons that there's this ongoing investigation. They need to get answers. But, I mean, the obvious thing would be to look at the context in which those talking points were changed, were rewritten. The Washington Post fact-checker this morning actually says that the talking points were rewritten wholesale, and I think that's an accurate description. I mean, this was 5 days after the president gave a speech at the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte and said, in effect, al-Qaeda is on its path to death and Osama bin Laden is dead. 6 weeks before the presidential election. I think if you look at it in that context, there are certainly reasons to be suspicious that there were political motives behind at least some of the changes.
Well, and let's delve into that a little bit further. I mean, this specifically, right after these attacks, you remember that evening Mitt Romney sent out made a statement where he criticized the American embassy in Egypt for buying into this narrative that this YouTube video was really responsible for all of these attacks. By criticizing that, it gave the president a bit of a political talking point the next day to say, oh, Mitt Romney shouldn't have done that. You don't get out in front of these things. You don't act that way when you're the chief executive. In retrospect now, knowing what the president knew and what the State Department knew and the way that they rewrote these talking points, Mitt Romney was kind of right.
Yeah, he was. I mean, I think the importance of that event, and I think you're right to raise it, has much more to do with the media than it does even with the White House. Because I think what it did was it allowed the media who were covering the presidential campaign and the media continuing in many respects to this day to look at this through a political prism. This was the way that it was introduced to the media by this being a campaign event and by Mitt Romney making those comments. And that's the way that the media have chosen to treat this. And if you look at sort of the bare facts of the case, I mean, consider what we now know. We have these talking points. We have the different versions of the talking points. It's very clear that the talking points were rewritten, were changed substantively. We now have these officials that you alluded to who are going to be testifying before the House tomorrow, who are giving firsthand accounts of what took place before that night, during that night, and after that night. Credible, by all accounts, credible witnesses in a position to speak with some authority to what happened. And yet, the New York Times, unless I missed it this morning, is still not covering these issues.
Well,
it really is rather remarkable. And the networks, with the exception of CBS, have largely taken a pass as well.
All right, so there were 2 things that they wanted out of the talking points. Number one, that they had been warned repeatedly about a potential problem. They didn't want that in the narrative. And They didn't want in the narrative the stuff that there were Islamic jihadists involved in it, that it was basically a terror attack. And the person who apparently was most instrumental in getting this information taken out of the talking points in your story is identified as Miss Newland over at the State Department.
Well, she was the one who, at the very least, first communicated to this interagency process. Basically, what happened was these emails were being circulated all day on Friday, September 14th, and then again on Saturday, September 15th. And she was the one, as a spokesman for the State Department, who sort of flagged the emails and the talking points and said, look, this is not what we want to be saying. My building has concerns about this. And in a couple of email exchanges she had with CIA folks, as you say, Brian, they took out some references to Ansar al-Sharia, which is one of the local al-Qaeda affiliates. And then, her mention of my building leadership not being happy about this has caused
the exact quote was the exact quote was, the changes, she wrote, did not resolve all my issues or those of my building leadership.
Right. And the fact is, she's a fairly high-ranking State Department official, so if she's voicing the concerns of her building leadership, there are a limited number of people who that could mean.
Who that could be, that's right.
Congressional investigators very interested in looking again at Hillary Clinton.
Stephen Hayes, by the way, while we were talking, I just did a quick search at NewYorkTimes.com. Yeah, no mention of this story. No mention of the testimony for tomorrow's scheduled hearing, and also no mention of your story about the altered talking points.
Let me, Larry, if I can just make a prediction. When the Times does cover it, it will be about the Republicans going after the president on Benghazi. That's just a guess. If I'm wrong, I'd be happy to come on and you can make fun of me for being wrong.
We would love to do that, Stephen. But let me just ask you really quickly, because we talk about Hillary and we talk about the leadership in that building at Foggy Bottom. Are they setting this up in a way where most of tomorrow's committee hearing is going to be Democrats trying to protect Hillary Clinton?
I would expect that that's what Democrats will use their time to do, to a limited extent. Stephen Lynch, a representative from Massachusetts, was on Fox News Sunday over the weekend and was asked directly about the changing of the talking points, and he said, without qualification, look, the talking points were scrubbed. That's what he said. That's a pretty tough assessment. I think it's true.
But that's passive. It doesn't say who scrubbed them, and that's really the key point, isn't it?
Well, that's true, but I would say, baby steps. Getting them to acknowledge that they had, in fact, been scrubbed is not a small thing. And I think, look, if you look at the facts as they're laid out in that piece, and as others have talked about them, there's a Washington Post fact checker on this all this morning. And if you look at the facts as they're laid out, it's inescapable that the talking points were manipulated.
All right.
So
well,
it's not a huge admission.
Even the Washington Post is writing this morning that new details are certain to reignite a debate over whether the Obama administration has been sufficiently forthcoming. When you hear the Washington Post start to talk like that, I would say the administration has a problem on their hands.
Yeah. Stay
All right,
on
Steve,
it, Steve Hayes. Stay on it.
Good work, my friend, and come back if you have new developments, okay?
Will do. Thanks, guys.